The river's icy embrace tightened around Victoria Steele as she thrashed against the merciless current, her lungs burning for air that seemed a lifetime away. The spring flood had transformed the normally placid Colorado River into a raging monster, and Victoria was losing the battle with each passing second. Colorado Territory. 1871. Victoria had never planned to end up in the rushing waters of the Colorado River on that crisp April morning. At 22, she had left behind her comfortable life in Boston to forge her own path in the untamed Western Territories. Her father's passing 6 months prior had left her with a modest inheritance and a yearning for something more than the stifling drawing rooms of proper society. Columbus, Colorado Territory, had seemed promising when she'd read about it in an Eastern newspaper. A growing settlement with opportunities for a determined young woman willing to work hard. The stagecoach journey had been grueling, but Victoria had endured it with her chin held high, her father's pocket watch tucked safely in her valise along with her most treasured books and the remainder of her inheritance money. The stagecoach had deposited her in Columbus just the previous afternoon. She'd secured a room at the town's only boarding house, run by a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Blackburn, who'd eyed Victoria's fine traveling clothes with undisguised suspicion. "Not much call for fancy Eastern ladies here," Mrs. Blackburn had remarked dryly, accepting Victoria's payment for a week's lodging. "Unless you're planning to work at the Silver Spur." Victoria had quickly gathered that the Silver Spur was not an establishment where a respectable woman would seek employment. She'd politely informed Mrs. Blackburn that she intended to inquire about a position at the town schoolhouse, or perhaps the general store. That morning, Victoria had risen early, eager to explore her new surroundings. The town was nestled in a picturesque valley, with towering mountains to the west and the river cutting along the eastern edge. She'd been warned by Mrs. Blackburn about the recent heavy rains making the river dangerous, but Victoria had only intended to admire it from a safe distance. The riverbank had been slippery with mud. One misstep, one moment of carelessness as she tried to retrieve her handkerchief caught on a branch, and suddenly Victoria had found herself plunging into the frigid water. The current had immediately seized her, pulling her away from shore with terrifying speed. Now, her sodden skirts wrapped around her legs like leaden weights, dragging her down despite her desperate struggles. Her lungs screamed for air as she fought to keep her head above water. "Help!" She managed to cry out when she briefly broke the surface, but her voice was a mere whisper against the river's roar. The town was already far behind her, and despair gripped her heart as tightly as the current gripped her body. Her strength was fading. Darkness edged her vision as she went under again, no longer able to fight the river's pull. "So this is how it ends," she thought with a strange clarity. Not the new beginning she'd hoped for, but a cold, lonely death in an unfamiliar river. As consciousness began to slip away, Victoria dimly registered a splash nearby, different from the river's chaotic pattern. Strong arms suddenly encircled her waist, pulling upward with powerful strokes. Her head broke the surface, and she gasped involuntarily, water and air filling her lungs in equal measure. "I've got you," a deep voice said close to her ear. "Stop fighting me or we'll both go under." Victoria went limp, allowing her rescuer to tow her through the churning waters. The journey to shore seemed endless, punctuated by her rescuer's labored breathing and occasional muttered curses as the current fought to reclaim them both. Finally, she felt rocks beneath her, then mud, and then she was being half dragged, half carried onto the riverbank. She collapsed onto her side, coughing violently as water poured from her lungs. "That's it," the voice encouraged, a hand patting her back with surprising gentleness. "Get it all out." When Victoria could finally draw a full breath without coughing, she rolled onto her back and looked up at her savior. A man knelt beside her, water streaming from his dark hair and beard. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy: denim trousers, a sodden cotton shirt, and a vest that had once been leather but now clung to his broad shoulders like a second skin. His hat was gone, likely claimed by the river. His eyes, a startling shade of blue against his sun-darkened face, assessed her with concern. "Thank you," Victoria whispered, her voice raw from river water and coughing. "You saved my life." The man nodded, still catching his breath. "Saw you from upstream when I was checking on a strayed calf." "Didn't think I'd reach you in time," he frowned. "What in God's name possessed you to go swimming in spring flood?" "I didn't intend," Victoria began, then dissolved into another fit of coughing. "Save your breath," he said, his expression softening. "Can you stand? We need to get you warm and dry before the shock sets in." Victoria tried to rise, but her limbs felt leaden, and her sodden clothing weighed her down like anchors. The cowboy muttered something under his breath, before gathering her into his arms as easily as if she were a child. "My name is Hayes," he said as he began walking, carrying her away from the treacherous riverbank. "Hayes Barrett. I have a cabin not far from here. We'll get you warmed up, then I'll take you back to town." "Victoria Steele," she managed to reply, fighting against the violent shivers that now racked her body. "I only arrived in Columbus yesterday." "Not much of a welcome the river gave you, Miss Steele," Hayes remarked dryly. Victoria wanted to respond, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision again, this time from exhaustion rather than drowning. She let her head rest against Hayes's shoulder, too weary to maintain proper decorum. "Stay awake," Hayes ordered, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Talk to me, Miss Steele. What brings an Eastern lady like yourself to a rough place like Columbus?" Victoria forced her eyes open. "How do you know I'm from the East?" Hayes's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Your accent, and those fancy boots that are probably ruined now." "I came for a new beginning," Victoria said, her teeth chattering. "My father passed away and there was nothing left for me in Boston." "Alone?" Hayes asked, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. Victoria nodded, then immediately regretted the movement as it made her dizzy. "I have no family remaining." Hayes didn't respond, but his grip on her tightened slightly as he navigated a rocky patch of ground. Victoria could see a small cabin ahead, smoke curling from its chimney. "You're fortunate," Hayes said after a moment. "Most folks who end up in the river during spring flood don't live to tell about it." "I'm aware of my good fortune," Victoria replied, finding a hint of her usual spirit returning. "And I'm deeply grateful for your bravery, Mr. Barrett." Something flickered across Hayes's face, discomfort, perhaps, at her gratitude. It wasn't bravery, just happened to be in the right place. They reached the cabin door, which Hayes managed to push open with his shoulder without putting Victoria down. The interior was simple but neat: a wooden table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with a cooking pot hanging above the flames, a narrow bed in the corner, and various tools and supplies organized on shelves along the walls. Hayes set Victoria down carefully in a chair near the fireplace. "Stay there," he instructed, as if she might wander off. He moved to a trunk at the foot of the bed and extracted a woolen blanket and what appeared to be a large shirt. "You need to get out of those wet clothes. I'll step outside while you change into this. It'll be too big, but it's dry." Victoria clutched the offered items, suddenly acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation. She was alone in a strange man's cabin, about to disrobe. Yet what choice did she have? Her clothes were soaked through, and she could feel the dangerous chill setting into her bones. "Thank you," she said stiffly, propriety warring with practicality. Hayes seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll be right outside the door. Call if you need help, but otherwise I won't come in until you say it's all right." His voice was matter-of-fact, without a hint of impropriety. As soon as the door closed behind him, Victoria began struggling with her sodden clothing. Her fingers were numb and clumsy, making the buttons of her dress nearly impossible to manage. After several frustrating minutes, she managed to free herself from the heavy, waterlogged fabric. Her undergarments presented another challenge, but the growing warmth from the fire gave her enough dexterity to eventually strip down completely. She dried herself as best she could with a corner of the blanket, then pulled on Hayes's shirt. It hung past her knees, the sleeves extending well beyond her fingertips until she rolled them up. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, then gathered her wet clothing and laid the items carefully near the fire to dry. Only then did she call out, "You may come in now, Mr. Barrett." The door opened, and Hayes entered, carrying an armload of firewood. He added several logs to the fire before turning to look at Victoria. If he found anything amusing or inappropriate about her appearance in his oversized shirt, he gave no indication. "Better?" he asked, moving to hang a kettle over the fire. "Much, thank you," Victoria replied, clutching the blanket more tightly around her shoulders. "I don't know how to repay your kindness, Mr. Barrett." Hayes shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No need for repayment. Anyone would have done the same." "I think we both know that's not true," Victoria said softly. "You risked your own life to save a stranger." Hayes busied himself preparing 2 tin cups. "Tea will help warm you from the inside," he said, ignoring her comment. Victoria studied him as he moved efficiently around the small cabin. He had changed into dry clothing as well, simple trousers and a faded blue shirt. Without the distraction of her near drowning, she could now see that Hayes Barrett was a handsome man, perhaps 30 years of age, with the lean, muscular build of someone who worked hard for his living. "Are you a rancher, Mr. Barrett?" Victoria asked, trying to divert her thoughts from his physical appearance. "Of sorts," Hayes replied, pouring hot water into the cups. "I manage the Double Creek Ranch for Mr. James Montgomery. He owns most of the grazing land east of town." He handed her a steaming cup. "It's not fancy tea like you might be used to, but it'll warm you." Victoria accepted the cup gratefully. "I appreciate it all the same." She took a careful sip, finding the tea strong but comforting. "And please call me Victoria. I think pulling someone from a river earns the right to use their given name." Hayes nodded slowly. "Victoria, then." He settled into the chair opposite her, cradling his own cup. "So what exactly were you planning to do in Columbus? It's not exactly a place that attracts Eastern ladies." "I intend to work," Victoria replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I had hoped to secure a position at the school if there is one. I was well educated at my father's insistence, and I have some experience tutoring younger children." Hayes's expression registered surprise, then something that might have been respect. "There is a school, though it's hardly what you'd be used to. 1 room, children of all ages. The last teacher left 3 months ago, married a minor, and moved to California." Hope flared in Victoria's chest. "Then perhaps there's an opportunity there. Do you know who I should speak with about the position?" "Mayor Hollister oversees town affairs like that," Hayes replied. "But Victoria—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Columbus isn't Boston. Life here is hard, especially for a woman alone. The winters are brutal, comforts are few, and the people—" He shrugged. "They're good folks mostly, but they're suspicious of outsiders, particularly those who speak and dress like you do." Victoria set her cup down with a little more force than necessary. Mr. Barrett Hayes, I may have been raised in comfort, but I'm not afraid of hard work or hardship. My father lost most of his fortune in his final years, and I've had to adjust my expectations accordingly. I came west because I saw opportunity here that no longer existed for me in Boston. Hayes studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. Fair enough, he finally said. I'm not trying to discourage you, just want you to know what you're facing. They fell into silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional drip of water from Victoria's clothes. Despite the warmth of the tea and the fire, exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. She fought to keep her eyes open, not wanting to appear weak or ungrateful. Hayes noticed her struggle. "You need rest," he said, rising from his chair. "Take the bed. I'll wake you in a few hours, and if your clothes are dry enough, I'll take you back to town before dark." Victoria wanted to protest. Taking his bed seemed an imposition too far, but the thought of lying down was irresistible. "Just for a little while," she conceded, rising unsteadily to her feet. Hayes caught her elbow when she swayed. "The river takes more out of you than you realize," he said quietly. "Even when you survive it." Victoria nodded, allowing him to guide her to the narrow bed. As soon as her head touched the pillow, exhaustion claimed her completely. When Victoria awoke, the quality of light in the cabin had changed, suggesting late afternoon. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself. The events of the morning came rushing back: the river, the struggle for breath, Hayes's strong arms pulling her to safety. She sat up slowly, relieved to find that most of her strength had returned. Hayes was seated at the table, mending what appeared to be a bridle, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small leather working tools. "How long did I sleep?" Victoria asked, her voice still rough from the river water. Hayes looked up, setting aside his work. "About 4 hours. "How do you feel?" "Much better, thank you." Victoria ran a hand through her tangled hair, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "Your clothes are mostly dry," Hayes said, gesturing to where he'd hung them from a line strung near the fireplace. "They'll be a bit damp still, but not soaking. I'll step outside while you dress." Once again, Victoria found herself alone in the cabin, rushing to change before Hayes returned. Her clothes were indeed still damp in places, particularly the heavy skirt, but they were wearable. Her boots, however, were stiff and misshapen from their dunking in the river. When she was as presentable as circumstances allowed, Victoria called for Hayes to return. He entered carrying a pair of worn leather gloves which he tucked into his belt. "I've saddled my horse," he said. "I'll take you back to town now." "Thank you," Victoria replied, gathering her few possessions. "For everything." Hayes nodded, his expression unreadable. "The river can be treacherous even for those who know it well. You'd be wise to keep your distance, especially during the spring melt." "I've certainly learned that lesson," Victoria assured him. The ride to Columbus was largely silent. Victoria sat behind Hayes on his sturdy roan gelding, her arms encircling his waist for balance. Despite her embarrassment at the intimate position, she found herself grateful for his solid presence and the warmth of his body against the cool evening air. As they approached the outskirts of town, Victoria finally spoke. "Will you be in Columbus often?" "I would like to properly thank you once I'm settled." Hayes was quiet for a moment before answering. "I come to town for supplies every couple of weeks. The ranch keeps me busy otherwise." Victoria sensed his reluctance and didn't press further. When they reached the boarding house, Hayes dismounted first, then helped her down with strong, steady hands at her waist. "Thank you again, Mr. Barrett," Victoria said formally, aware of curious eyes watching from the boarding house windows. "I owe you my life." Hayes touched the brim of his hat, which he'd retrieved from a hook in his cabin. "Take care of yourself, Miss Steele. Columbus can be as dangerous as that river in its own way." With that cryptic warning, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Victoria standing in the dusty street, watching his retreating figure until it disappeared around a bend. Mrs. Blackburn had 1,000 questions about Victoria's bedraggled appearance and the identity of the rough-looking cowhand who had brought her back to the boarding house. Victoria provided only the briefest explanation, claiming she had fallen while exploring the riverbank and that Mr. Barrett had kindly assisted her. The older woman clearly didn't believe the sanitized version of events, but she seemed to accept that Victoria wasn't going to elaborate. She did, however, offer one piece of information that caught Victoria's interest. "That Barrett fellow keeps to himself mostly," Mrs. Blackburn remarked as she served Victoria a simple supper of beans and cornbread. "Been working at Double Creek for about 3 years now. Came from somewhere back east, they say, though he doesn't talk about it. Good with horses, better with a gun. Not the sort a respectable young lady should be associating with." Victoria merely nodded, not willing to engage in gossip about the man who had saved her life. Yet she couldn't help but wonder about Hayes Barrett's past. What had brought him to this remote corner of the Colorado Territory, and why did he maintain such distance from the town and its people? The next morning, Victoria put these questions aside and focused on her original purpose in coming to Columbus. Dressed in her second-best dress, the only one not damaged by the river, she made her way to the mayor's office, a small room attached to the general store. Mayor Hollister was a portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers and an air of self-importance that seemed at odds with the modest surroundings of his office. He listened with visible skepticism as Victoria explained her qualifications and interest in the teaching position. "We've had some inquiries about the position," he said, leaning back in his creaking chair. "Mostly from local ladies. The school board tends to prefer someone who understands the particular challenges of frontier education." "I understand your concerns," Victoria replied calmly. "But I assure you, I'm a quick learner and not afraid of challenges. Perhaps you would allow me to demonstrate my abilities. I would be happy to teach for a trial period." Mayor Hollister stroked his whiskers thoughtfully. "The school's been closed since Miss Appleton left. Children running wild, parents complaining." He sighed heavily. "I suppose a trial period couldn't hurt. 2 weeks. If the school board approves at that point, we can discuss a more permanent arrangement." Victoria's heart soared with relief and excitement. "Thank you, Mayor Hollister." "When may I begin?" "Monday next," he replied. "That gives you 4 days to prepare. The schoolhouse is at the north end of town. Mrs. Henderson at the general store has the key. She'll show you where everything is." Victoria left the mayor's office with a lighter step than she'd had since arriving in Columbus. She had secured employment, temporary though it might be, and a chance to prove herself to the community. The river might have nearly claimed her life, but perhaps it had also washed her toward the new beginning she sought. The next 4 days passed in a flurry of activity as Victoria prepared for her first day of teaching. Mrs. Henderson, a kindly woman with gray-streaked hair and work-roughened hands, proved an invaluable ally. She not only showed Victoria the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building with rows of battered desks, a pot-bellied stove, and a scarred teacher's desk at the front, but also introduced her to several families with school-age children. The parents Victoria met displayed varying degrees of skepticism about the Eastern lady who would be teaching their children, but most seemed relieved that the school would be reopening. Victoria learned that she could expect approximately 20 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, with widely differing levels of previous education. On Monday morning, Victoria arrived at the schoolhouse an hour before the students were due. She had spent much of her small savings on teaching supplies and had stayed up late the night before preparing lessons suitable for different age groups. Her near drowning had faded to a frightening memory, though her dreams were still sometimes filled with rushing water and a desperate struggle for breath. As she arranged her desk and wrote a welcome message on the blackboard, Victoria's thoughts drifted to Hayes Barrett. She hadn't seen him since he'd left her at the boarding house 5 days ago. Mrs. Blackburn had mentioned that the Double Creek Ranch was a half-day's ride from town, making frequent visits impractical. Still, Victoria found herself hoping their paths would cross again, if only so she could express her gratitude more adequately. The sound of approaching voices interrupted her thoughts. Victoria smoothed her skirts, took a deep breath, and moved to the schoolhouse door to greet her first students. The following 2 weeks were among the most challenging of Victoria's life. Her students were a diverse group, from the shy 6-year-old daughter of the town's blacksmith to the sullen 16-year-old son of a rancher who made it clear he believed his time would be better spent working his father's land. Some of the children had received consistent schooling and could read and cipher competently, while others could barely recognize their letters. Victoria quickly abandoned her carefully prepared lessons in favor of a more flexible approach, grouping students by ability rather than age and setting the older, more advanced children to helping the younger ones while she moved between groups. By the end of the first week, she had earned the respect of most of her students through a combination of firm discipline, genuine interest in their progress, and a willingness to adapt to their needs. The parents proved more difficult to win over. Some, particularly those from backgrounds similar to Victoria's, were immediately supportive. Others regarded her with suspicion, viewing her refined speech and Eastern education as signs that she might fill their children's heads with impractical ideas. When the school board, consisting of Mayor Hollister, the town's physician Dr. Wallace, and 3 prominent local businessmen convened to evaluate Victoria's performance, she faced their questioning with a calm confidence she didn't entirely feel. "The children seem to be learning, Dr. Wallace acknowledged, "but we're concerned about your adaptability to our way of life, Miss Steele. Teaching here isn't just about books and figures. It's about preparing these young people for the realities they'll face." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your concern, Dr. Wallace. I've tried to demonstrate my commitment to understanding those realities. I've spent time with Mrs. Henderson learning about local history and challenges. I've modified the curriculum to include practical mathematics using examples from ranching and trade. And I've begun a project where the older students are documenting their families' experiences settling this region." Mayor Hollister exchanged glances with the other board members. "Those are commendable initiatives, Miss Steele." "Furthermore," Victoria continued, sensing an opportunity, "I've arranged for several local craftsmen to visit the school in the coming weeks to demonstrate their skills. Mr. Jensen, the blacksmith, has agreed to explain the principles of metallurgy, and Mrs. Peterson will demonstrate how mathematical principles apply to quilting patterns." This last announcement raised eyebrows among the board members, who clearly hadn't expected such integration with the community from the newcomer. After further discussion and questioning, Mayor Hollister cleared his throat importantly. "Well, Miss Steele, the board has decided to extend your position through the end of the current term, which concludes in June. At that time, we'll reevaluate for the fall term." Victory surged through Victoria's chest, though she maintained a composed expression. "Thank you for your confidence, gentlemen. I won't disappoint you." As Victoria left the meeting, relief and pride mingled with a new sense of belonging. In just 2 weeks, Columbus had begun to feel less like a strange outpost and more like a place where she might truly build a life. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar figure on horseback, passing through the main street. Hayes Barrett sat tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low over his eyes as he guided his roan gelding toward the general store. Without conscious decision, Victoria changed direction to intercept him. Hayes had just dismounted and was tying his horse to the hitching post when Victoria approached. He looked up at her footsteps, surprise briefly crossing his features before his expression settled into its usual reserve. "Miss Steele," he greeted her, touching the brim of his hat. "Good to see you're keeping away from the river." "Mr. Barrett," Victoria replied with a small smile. "Yes, I've found less dangerous ways to occupy my time." Hayes's gaze moved to the schoolhouse visible at the end of the street. "Heard you took over the teaching position. How's that working out for you?" "Well, I think," Victoria said, "the school board just extended my position through June." Hayes nodded. "Good. Children need learning, especially out here where life can be hard." Something in his tone suggested personal knowledge of such hardships. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the stamp of Hayes's horse and distant voices from the saloon down the street. "I never properly thanked you," Victoria finally said, "for saving my life." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "You thanked me plenty at the time." "Nevertheless," Victoria persisted, "I would like to express my gratitude more adequately. Perhaps you would allow me to prepare a meal for you, Mrs. Blackburn has permitted me use of the boarding house kitchen on Sundays when she visits her sister." Hayes studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. "That's not necessary, Miss Steele." "Victoria," she corrected gently, "and it would please me to do so." "Unless you find my company objectionable." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Hayes's mouth. "Your company isn't objectionable, Victoria, but a proper Eastern lady preparing a meal for a ranch hand would set tongues wagging in a town like Columbus." "Let them wag," Victoria replied with more boldness than she felt. "I'm finding that frontier life requires less concern for trivial proprieties." Hayes regarded her with what might have been new respect. "Sunday, then," he finally agreed. "What time?" 2 o'clock, Mrs. Blackburn leaves after the church service." Hayes nodded. "I'll be there." He tipped his hat again and turned toward the general store, effectively ending the conversation. Victoria walked back toward the schoolhouse with a curious lightness in her step. She told herself it was merely satisfaction at having properly arranged to thank her rescuer, nothing more. Yet she couldn't deny a flutter of anticipation at the thought of seeing Hayes Barrett again, this time without the drama of near drowning or the awkwardness of wearing his clothing. Sunday seemed impossibly distant, though in reality, it was only 3 days away. Victoria threw herself into her teaching duties with renewed vigor, introducing new lessons and continuing to build relationships with both students and parents. By the time Sunday arrived, she had earned the vocal support of several influential families, further securing her position in the community. Mrs. Blackburn departed for her sister's home promptly after church services concluded, giving Victoria a stern warning about maintaining proper decorum in her absence. The older woman had clearly heard about Hayes Barrett's expected visit and disapproved, though she couldn't reasonably object to Victoria thanking the man who had saved her life. Victoria had spent her meager teacher's salary on ingredients for a special meal, a roast chicken with root vegetables, fresh bread from the town bakery, and apples baked with cinnamon and sugar for dessert. She had begun preparations the previous evening, and rose early to continue them before church. By 1:30, the boarding house was filled with enticing aromas, and Victoria had changed from her church dress into a simpler blue cotton dress that was practical for serving a meal yet still presentable. She had just removed the chicken from the oven when a knock sounded at the back door. Hayes Barrett stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His shirt was clean and pressed, his boots polished, and his usually untamed hair was neatly combed. He held an awkward bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the prairie. "These are for you," he said, thrusting them toward Victoria. Seemed the proper thing to bring. Victoria accepted the flowers with genuine pleasure. "They're beautiful, thank you. Please come in." Hayes entered the kitchen cautiously, as if expecting a trap. His eyes widened slightly at the array of food prepared on the table. "You didn't need to go to so much trouble," he said. "It was no trouble," Victoria assured him, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Please sit down. Everything is ready." The meal began with a certain stiffness, but as they ate, the atmosphere gradually relaxed. Hayes complimented the food sincerely, and Victoria found herself sharing stories about her attempts to master the temperamental boarding house oven. Mrs. Blackburn insisted it was simple enough, but my first loaf of bread was hard enough to use as a building stone, Victoria confessed, laughing at the memory. Hayes smiled a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Reminds me of my first attempts at camp cooking when I came west. Made a stew so bitter with wild onions that even my horse wouldn't come near me for days." Victoria's curiosity, long simmering, finally overcame her politeness. "Mrs. Blackburn mentioned you came from somewhere back east. May I ask where?" Hayes's expression immediately shuddered, the brief openness vanishing. "Pennsylvania originally," he said after a pause, "but that was a long time ago." Victoria recognized the closing of a door but pressed gently. "What brought you to Colorado territory?" Hayes set down his fork with deliberate care. "A need for distance from the past," he said quietly, "like many out here." Something in his tone warned Victoria not to inquire further, at least for now. She skillfully turned the conversation to safer topics: the Double Creek Ranch where he worked, the challenges of the coming cattle drive season, her experiences with the schoolchildren. By the time they reached dessert, Hayes had relaxed again, even sharing amusing anecdotes about some of the cowboys he worked with and their misadventures on the range. Victoria found herself laughing more than she had since before her father's illness, and she noted with pleasure that Hayes seemed to enjoy making her laugh. After the meal, Victoria insisted that Hayes relax while she cleared the table. He ignored her, helping to carry dishes to the wash basin and rolling up his sleeves to assist with the washing up. "My mother would rise from her grave and box my ears if I let a lady clean up alone after she'd cooked for me," he explained when Victoria protested. This casual mention of his mother gave Victoria another small glimpse into Hayes's past, and she carefully stored the information away. Working together, they made quick work of the dishes, their hands occasionally brushing in the soapy water, sending inexplicable tingles up Victoria's arms. When everything was clean and put away, an awkward silence fell between them. The meal was over, the proper thanks had been given, and there was no reasonable excuse for Hayes to linger. "I should go," he said finally, reaching for his hat. "Thank you for the meal, it was very kind of you." "You're welcome," Victoria replied, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. Perhaps you would consider visiting the school sometime. The children are learning about local industries and resources. They would benefit from hearing about ranching from someone with your experience." Hayes looked surprised at the invitation. I'm not much for public speaking, especially to children. They're not as intimidating as they seem, Victoria assured him with a smile. And it needn't be formal, just a conversation about your work, perhaps showing them some tools of the trade. Hayes considered this for a long moment. I suppose I could, he finally conceded. Next time I'm in town for supplies, likely in a week or two, Victoria beamed. Wonderful. The children will be thrilled. As Hayes prepared to leave, Victoria impulsively touched his arm. Thank you again, Hayes. Not just for the rescue, but for today. It's been pleasant to have company. Hayes looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. Something passed between them, a connection that transcended the brief time they'd known each other. It has been pleasant, he agreed softly. Then, with a nod, he placed his hat on his head and departed, leaving Victoria standing in the doorway, watching his retreating figure with a curious sense of loss. The following weeks brought a steady rhythm to Victoria's life in Columbus. Her days were filled with teaching, her evenings with preparation for lessons and occasional social interactions with other townspeople who had gradually accepted her presence. She had begun taking supper once a week with Dr. Wallace and his wife, who had become unexpected allies in her integration into the community. True to his word, Hayes Barrett appeared at the schoolhouse 2 weeks after their Sunday meal. His presentation to the children was initially awkward, his discomfort with public speaking evident in his stiff posture and terse responses to questions. But when 10-year-old Samuel Peterson asked about breaking wild horses, Hayes's entire demeanor changed. He became animated, demonstrating techniques with pieces of rope he'd brought along and sharing stories that had the children alternately wide-eyed with excitement and laughing at cowboy mishaps. Victoria watched from her desk, warmed by the transformation in Hayes and the rapt attention of her students. When the school day ended, she approached him as the children filed out, chattering excitedly about what they had learned. "You have a gift for storytelling, Mr. Barrett," she said warmly. The children were captivated. Hayes ducked his head, seemingly embarrassed by the praise. "They're good kids, ask smart questions. Would you consider coming again, perhaps next month? We'll be studying local wildlife and its importance to the ecosystem." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Eco what now?" Victoria laughed. "Ecosystem, how plants, animals, and the land all work together. Your knowledge of the land would be valuable." "I reckon I could," Hayes agreed, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "If you're sure the children wouldn't prefer someone more educated." "They would prefer you," Victoria said with certainty. "As would I," she added before she could reconsider the words. A flush rose to Hayes's tanned cheeks, surprising Victoria. This man who faced raging rivers and wild horses without flinching was blushing at her simple statement of preference for his company. "I should be getting back to the ranch," Hayes said, clearly flustered. "Mr. Montgomery doesn't pay me to spend the day entertaining schoolchildren." "Of course," Victoria replied. "But perhaps, would you care to join me for supper before you ride back? It's not Sunday, but Mrs. Blackburn is visiting a friend this evening, and I have a stew simmering." Hayes hesitated, visibly torn. "I shouldn't," he finally said. "There's talk in town already about your kindness to me. I wouldn't want to damage your reputation." Victoria felt a flash of irritation. "My reputation is my concern, Mr. Barrett. And I'm merely offering a meal to someone who has been kind enough to assist with my students' education." Hayes studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but I'll leave before dark. That should quiet the worst of the gossip." The shared meal was even more relaxed than their previous encounter, with conversation flowing easily between topics ranging from books they had read to the challenges of the coming winter. Victoria learned that Hayes had a surprising knowledge of literature, though he claimed not to have opened a book in years. "My father was a schoolteacher," he explained when Victoria expressed surprise at his familiarity with Shakespeare. "He believed education was the path to a better life. Made sure my brother and I knew our letters and numbers before we ever set foot in a schoolhouse." It was the most personal information Hayes had shared about his past, and Victoria treasured it, adding it to the small collection of facts she had gathered about this enigmatic man. "Your father sounds like a wise man," she said gently. "Is he still living?" Hayes's expression darkened. "No, both my parents are long gone." His tone made it clear he wouldn't elaborate further. Victoria gracefully changed the subject, and the shadow lifted from Hayes's features as they discussed safer topics. When he finally rose to leave, considerably later than his stated intention of departing before dark, there was a reluctance in his movements that matched Victoria's own feelings. "Thank you for the meal," Hayes said, standing awkwardly by the door, "and for making me feel welcome." "You are welcome, Hayes," Victoria replied softly. "Always." Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth, a longing that made Victoria's breath catch. For a moment she thought he might step closer, might even reach for her hand. Instead, he nodded once, placed his hat firmly on his head, and departed into the gathering dusk. May slipped into June, bringing warmer weather and the end of the school term. Victoria's position had been secured for the fall term, a victory that filled her with both pride and a sense of belonging. Columbus was beginning to feel like home, its people like neighbors rather than strangers. Hayes Barrett had become a regular visitor to the schoolhouse, appearing once every 2 weeks to share his knowledge with the children. Each visit concluded with a meal at the boarding house, a pattern that raised eyebrows but generated less gossip as it became routine. Victoria found herself counting the days between his visits, her heart lifting whenever she caught sight of his tall figure riding into town. They had settled into a comfortable friendship, yet Victoria was increasingly aware of undercurrents that suggested the potential for something more. Occasionally, she would look up to find Hayes watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Sometimes, their hands would brush as they worked together in her small kitchen, and neither would hurry to break the contact. Yet Hayes maintained a careful distance, never crossing the invisible line from friendship into courtship. Victoria sensed that his reticence stemmed not from lack of interest, but from some deeper concern, perhaps related to the past, he so carefully avoided discussing. The end of the school term was marked by a community celebration on the town green. Tables laden with food, games for the children, and music provided by local musicians created a festive atmosphere. Victoria moved among the townspeople, now greeted with genuine warmth rather than the suspicious glances of her early days in Columbus. She was helping organize a sack race for the younger children when a murmur ran through the crowd. Looking up, Victoria saw Hayes riding into town, accompanied by Mr. Montgomery, the owner of Double Creek Ranch, and several other cowboys. It was unusual to see Hayes at a community event. He typically came to town only for supplies or to visit the schoolhouse. As the men dismounted and joined the celebration, Victoria continued with the children's race, though her attention was repeatedly drawn to Hayes's tall figure as he moved through the crowd, stopping to speak with various townspeople. He looked different, somehow more polished than usual, wearing a clean shirt with a vest and his best pair of trousers. When the race concluded with much cheering and laughter, Victoria found Hayes standing nearby, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "I didn't expect to see you today," she said, pleasure evident in her voice. "Mr. Montgomery insisted the whole crew come to town for the celebration," Hayes replied. Said we'd worked hard enough this spring to deserve a day of leisure. I'm glad he did, Victoria said simply. Would you care to join me for some lemonade? Mrs. Peterson makes it with fresh mint, and it's wonderfully refreshing. Hayes nodded, falling into step beside her as they navigated through groups of chatting townspeople. Victoria was acutely aware of curious glances directed their way, but she held her head high. Her friendship with Hayes was no secret, and she refused to be cowed by small-town gossip. They had just reached the refreshment table when Mayor Hollister's voice boomed across the green, calling for attention. The crowd quieted as the mayor stood on an upturned crate, prepared to make an announcement. "Friends and neighbors," he began pompously, "as we celebrate the conclusion of another successful school term, I have an important announcement to make. Our esteemed teacher, Miss Steele, has not only secured her position for the coming fall, but has also agreed to expand her responsibilities by offering evening classes for adults wishing to improve their education." A murmur of interest ran through the crowd. Victoria smiled, though she felt a twinge of annoyance that the mayor had announced her plans before she had finalized all the details. "These classes will be open to all residents of Columbus," Mayor Hollister continued, "and will include instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. A nominal fee will be charged to cover supplies, but no one with a genuine desire to learn will be turned away for lack of funds." As the mayor droned on about the importance of education and the town's good fortune in having such a dedicated teacher, Victoria glanced at Hayes. He was watching her with an expression of unmistakable pride, and something else: a decision reached, a resolution formed. When the mayor finally concluded his speech and the crowd dispersed back to their various activities, Hayes turned to Victoria. "Evening classes?" he inquired, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You didn't mention that plan," Victoria sighed. "I was still working out the details. The mayor has a tendency to announce things before they're fully settled." "It's a good idea," Hayes said. "Many of the ranch hands never had proper schooling. Some can barely sign their names." "Would you be interested in attending?" Victoria asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Hayes looked away, a shadow crossing his features. "I told you, my father made sure I had my letters and numbers. I don't need schooling." "Of course," Victoria replied, trying to hide her disappointment. "I just thought, Miss Steele." The call came from Mrs. Wallace, the doctor's wife, who was waving urgently from across the green. "We need your help with the prizes for the older children's competition." Victoria excused herself reluctantly, promising to find Hayes later. The afternoon slipped away in a blur of activities, and though she caught glimpses of Hayes throughout the celebration, they didn't have another opportunity for private conversation. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the green, and the town's small band struck up music for dancing. Victoria found herself partnered with various townsmen: the widowed blacksmith, Dr. Wallace, even Mayor Hollister for a particularly awkward waltz. Through it all, she was aware of Hayes standing at the edge of the dancing area, watching with an unreadable expression. When the music paused for the musicians to rest, Victoria made her way toward Hayes, determined to at least bid him good night if he was planning to return to the ranch. Before she could reach him, however, young Sarah Jensen, the blacksmith's daughter and one of Victoria's students, intercepted her. "Miss Steele! Miss Steele!" the girl exclaimed, excitement making her voice breathless. "The river's rising again with the late snowmelt from the mountains. Papa says it's higher than he's ever seen it this time of year. Some of the boys are going down to look. Can we go too?" Victoria felt a cold shiver despite the warm June evening. Since her near drowning, she had avoided the river entirely, taking the long way around when her errands would have naturally taken her near the water. "That's not a good idea, Sarah," Victoria said firmly. "The river can be very dangerous, especially when it's running high. Remember what I taught you about natural hazards." Sarah's face fell with disappointment. "But Tommy and the other boys get to go." "Tommy and the other boys are making a poor decision," Victoria replied, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes. "The river isn't a toy or a spectacle. It's a powerful force that demands respect." "Like God?" Sarah asked innocently. Victoria smiled despite her concern. "Yes, something like that. Now, why don't you help your mother with the younger children? I believe they're organizing a lantern parade." As Sarah skipped off, Victoria rose and looked around for Hayes, alarmed to find he was no longer where she had last seen him. Scanning the crowd, she finally spotted him in conversation with Mr. Jensen, the blacksmith, their expression serious. After a brief exchange, both men strode purposefully toward the edge of town where the river flowed. Without conscious thought, Victoria followed, gathering her skirts to move more quickly through the dispersing crowd. She caught up with Hayes and Mr. Jensen just as they reached the path leading down to the riverbank. "Hayes," she called. "What's happening?" Both men turned, surprise registering on their faces at her presence. "Miss Steele," Mr. Jensen acknowledged with a nod. "You shouldn't be down here. The river's dangerous tonight." "I'm well aware of the river's dangers," Victoria replied with more sharpness than she intended. "What's going on?" Hayes stepped toward her, his expression grave. "Some of the town boys decided to take a log raft onto the river, despite warnings about the high water. Mr. Jensen just got word they're stranded on a sandbar mid-river and the water's still rising." Fear clutched at Victoria's heart. "Which boys?" "Tommy Wallace, the Peterson twins, and young Billy Hollister," Mr. Jensen replied. "All 12 or 13 years old enough to know better." Victoria felt sick. These were her students, children she had grown to care for deeply over the past months. "What are you planning to do?" "Jensen's gathering men with boats and ropes," Hayes explained. "I'm going to ride upstream and try to reach the boys from the far bank. It might be easier to get to them from that direction." "I'm coming with you," Victoria said immediately. Both men began to protest, but Victoria cut them off with a raised hand. "These are my students, my responsibility. I'm not suggesting I join the rescue effort directly, but I can help coordinate from shore, tend to the boys once they're rescued, and keep the inevitable crowd of onlookers at a safe distance." Hayes and Mr. Jensen exchanged glances, clearly weighing the practical benefits of her assistance against the propriety of having a woman present during a dangerous rescue. "All right," Hayes finally agreed, "but you stay well back from the water's edge. Promise me that, Victoria." The use of her given name underscored the seriousness of the situation. "I promise," she replied solemnly. The next hour passed in a blur of coordinated chaos. Word of the boys' predicament spread through the town, drawing a crowd of concerned parents and curious onlookers to the riverbank. Dr. Wallace arrived with his medical bag, prepared to treat any injuries. Mayor Hollister paced anxiously, his earlier pomposity replaced by genuine fear for his son and the other boys. Victoria found herself organizing the onlookers, keeping them back from the unstable banks while ensuring the rescue party had clear access to the river. She caught occasional glimpses of Hayes on the opposite bank, working with 2 other ranch hands to secure ropes between trees and prepare for a water crossing. The boys' situation was precarious. Their makeshift raft had become lodged on a temporary sandbar in the middle of the swollen river, but the rising water was gradually eroding their small island of safety. They huddled together, visibly terrified even from a distance, occasionally calling out for help when they thought their voices might carry over the river's roar. Mr. Jensen and several other men had launched 2 small boats, but the current proved too strong, forcing them to abort their attempt and regroup. On the far bank, Hayes and his companions seemed to be having more success, establishing a rope system that would allow a controlled approach to the stranded boys. Victoria watched with her heart in her throat as Hayes secured a rope around his waist and waded into the rushing water, using a second rope stretched across the river as a guideline. The current immediately grabbed at him, but Hayes fought against it, making slow progress toward the sandbar. "He's going to get himself killed," Mayor Hollister muttered, standing near Victoria. "That current's too strong for any man. If anyone can do it, Hayes can," Victoria replied with more confidence than she felt. "He knows the river." The mayor gave her a curious look but didn't comment further. Victoria held her breath as Hayes struggled through the deepest part of the channel, disappearing briefly underwater before resurfacing with a powerful stroke. When he finally reached the sandbar, a cheer went up from the assembled townspeople. The rescue itself was methodical. Hayes secured each boy with a rope, then signaled his companions on shore to pull them across, one by one. Tommy Wallace went first, followed by the Peterson twins. Young Billy Hollister was last, clearly the most frightened of the group. As the final boy reached the safety of the far bank, another cheer erupted from the crowd. Victoria felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Hayes remained on the sandbar, preparing for his own return journey, when a horrible cracking sound echoed across the water. Upstream, a massive log had broken free from a debris dam and was hurtling down the river directly toward the sandbar. Victoria screamed a warning, but her voice was lost in the general commotion and the river's roar. Hayes turned just in time to see the danger bearing down on him. With no time to secure himself properly, he dove into the river, attempting to swim clear of the log's path. The current caught him immediately, sweeping him downstream as the log crashed into the sandbar, obliterating the temporary island in a spray of sand and water. "Hayes!" Victoria's scream tore from her throat as she watched him disappear beneath the churning water. Without conscious thought, she began running along the riverbank, following his progress downstream, heedless of the shouts behind her. Hayes surfaced briefly, fighting against the current before disappearing again. Victoria kept pace on the shore, her eyes desperately scanning the water for any sign of him. When he reappeared, he was clearly struggling, the rope around his waist now a hindrance rather than a help as it snagged on submerged obstacles. Just ahead, the river bent sharply around a large boulder, creating a dangerous hydraulic that could trap and hold even the strongest swimmer. Victoria saw the danger an instant before Hayes was swept into it. Without hesitation, she grabbed a coiled rope that had been left on the bank by the rescue party and tied one end around a sturdy tree. "Miss Steele, don't," someone called from behind her, but Victoria was beyond heeding warnings. Clutching the rope with both hands, she waded into the shallows at the river's edge. The water immediately pulled at her skirts, threatening to drag her deeper, but Victoria held firm, extending the rope as far as she could reach. "Hayes," she shouted. The rope grabbed the rope. By some miracle, Hayes heard her. As the current carried him around the bend, he made a desperate lunge for the rope Victoria held outstretched. His fingers brushed it once, twice, then closed around it with a grip born of desperation. Victoria braced herself against the sudden weight as Hayes clung to the lifeline. The force of the current threatened to pull her into deeper water, but she wrapped the rope around her waist and leaned back, using her body as an anchor. "Hold on," she called. "Help is coming." Indeed, Mr. Jensen and several other men were racing along the bank toward them, having finally caught up with Victoria's impulsive chase downstream. They reached her just as her strength was beginning to fail, taking control of the rope and beginning the laborious process of pulling Hayes to shore. When Hayes finally emerged from the water, coughing and gasping for breath, Victoria felt her knees give way with relief. She sank to the ground, suddenly aware of her sodden clothing and the scrapes on her hands from gripping the rough rope. Hayes was quickly surrounded by the rescue party, who checked him for injuries while congratulating him on the successful rescue of the boys. Victoria remained where she was, content to watch from a distance, knowing Hayes was safe. As the group began making their way back toward town, Hayes broke away and approached Victoria, still sitting on the muddy riverbank. Without a word, he extended a hand to help her up. When she took it, he pulled her not just to her feet but into a fierce embrace. "You promised to stay away from the water," he murmured against her hair, his voice hoarse. Victoria pulled back enough to look up at him, suddenly not caring who might be watching. "And you promised to be careful," she countered. "I believe we're both equally poor at keeping our promises." Hayes laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy that Victoria had never heard from him before. Then, in full view of half the town, he lowered his head and kissed her with a passion that left no doubt about his feelings. When they finally separated, breathless and aware of the stunned silence around them, Hayes kept his arms firmly around Victoria's waist. "I nearly died twice in that river," he said softly, for her ears alone. "But I found something worth living for both times." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes as she understood his meaning. "Then perhaps the river isn't entirely cruel," she whispered. "It led me to you after all." The walk back to town was a triumphant procession. The 4 rescued boys, though thoroughly chastened by their near disaster, were hailed as survivors of a great adventure. Hayes was celebrated as the hero who had risked his life to save them. And if anyone noticed that Miss Steele walked beside him with her hand firmly clasped in his, they were wise enough not to comment directly. The events of that June evening transformed Victoria's place in the Columbus community. No longer was she viewed as merely the Eastern schoolteacher trying to fit in. She had proven herself one of them, someone willing to risk her own safety for the town's children, someone who understood the harsh realities of frontier life, yet faced them with courage. For Hayes, the change was equally profound but more personal. The careful distance he had maintained from the townspeople began to dissolve as he accepted their gratitude and, more reluctantly, their admiration. He began spending more time in Columbus, not just on supply runs or visits to the schoolhouse, but as an increasingly integral part of the community. Most significant was the change in his relationship with Victoria. The kiss by the riverbank had effectively announced their attachment to the entire town, making secret what had been previously only suspected. To Victoria's surprise, the reaction was largely positive. Mrs. Blackburn, after a token protest about proper courting procedures, simply added an extra place setting when Hayes came for supper, which was now several times a week rather than only on Sundays. As summer progressed, Hayes gradually shared more of his past with Victoria during their private conversations. She learned that he had indeed come from an educated family in Pennsylvania. His father had been not just a teacher but a professor at a small college, instilling in Hayes and his older brother a love of learning and literature. "What happened?" Victoria asked gently one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Why did you leave that life behind?" Hayes was silent for so long that Victoria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, colored with old pain. "The war," he said simply. "My brother Nathaniel joined the Union Army in '61. I was too young at first, but I followed as soon as I turned 18 in '63. Our father was proud, said we were fighting for the right cause, for freedom and to preserve the Union. Victoria remained silent, sensing that Hayes needed to tell this story in his own way, at his own pace. Nathaniel died at Cold Harbor. Hayes continued. I wasn't there, my regiment was elsewhere. Didn't even know until weeks later. Then came Appomattox and the war was over, but nothing felt finished. He paused, his jaw working. I went home, but everything had changed. My father had aged 20 years and my mother. She just seemed empty, like something vital had been carved out of her. Victoria reached for his hand, holding it tightly between both of hers. I tried to go back to studying, to be the son they still had, but I couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, kept seeing things, hearing things from the war. My father called it soldier's heart. Whatever it was, I couldn't live with it there, with them watching me fall apart. Hayes's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. So I left, headed west, thought maybe distance and open spaces would heal whatever was broken in me. Did it? Victoria asked softly. Hayes looked at her, his blue eyes clear in the fading light. Not at first. For years I drifted, worked ranches, drove cattle, took whatever jobs kept me moving, drank too much sometimes, fought too often. He squeezed her hand. But eventually, the spaces between the bad days got longer. I found I could sleep through the night more often than not. When Mr. Montgomery offered me a permanent position at Double Creek, I took it, thinking maybe it was time to stop running. And now? Victoria prompted when he fell silent again. A small smile touched Hayes's lips. Now I'm sitting on a porch with a beautiful woman who doesn't seem to mind that I'm damaged goods. So I'd say things have improved considerably. Victoria leaned against his shoulder, her heart full. You're not damaged goods, Hayes Barrett. You're a good man who has survived terrible things. There's a difference. Their courtship progressed through the summer months with a steady certainty that surprised them both. Hayes continued working at Double Creek Ranch, but arranged his schedule to spend more time in Columbus. He assisted with repairs to the schoolhouse, built new desks for the expected increase in students for the fall term, and even helped Victoria prepare materials for her planned evening classes for adults. To Victoria's delight, Hayes eventually admitted that he had been contemplating attending those classes himself, not for the basic education he already possessed, but to refresh knowledge long neglected during his years of wandering. My father would be pleased to see me opening a book again, he confided one evening as they reviewed the planned curriculum. He always said education was a lifelong pursuit, not something that ended with schooling. Your father sounds like a wise man, Victoria replied. You must have inherited his intelligence, even if you've kept it hidden beneath that cowboy exterior. Hayes laughed, a sound that had once been rare but was becoming pleasingly common. Don't let the other ranch hands hear you suggesting I have intelligence. They'll never let me live it down. As August drew to a close, Hayes approached Victoria with an uncharacteristic nervousness one Sunday afternoon. They had taken to walking together after church services, often following a path that led to a small meadow overlooking the town, but carefully avoiding the river that had both nearly claimed their lives and brought them together. I've been thinking, Hayes began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Victoria waited patiently, having learned that Hayes sometimes needed time to organize his thoughts, particularly when emotions were involved. The thing is, he tried again, I've been at Double Creek for 3 years now. Mr. Montgomery relies on me, made me foreman last spring. The pay is good, steady work. Yes, Victoria agreed, uncertain where this was leading. Hayes stopped walking and turned to face her directly. I've saved most of my wages, enough to make a start somewhere else if I wanted, or to build something here. Victoria's heart began to beat faster as she sensed the direction of his thoughts. "What would you want to build, Hayes?" "A life," he said simply. "A home." He took her hands in his expression earnest and vulnerable in a way that made Victoria's breath catch. "With you, if you'd be willing." "Hayes Barrett," Victoria said carefully, "are you proposing marriage to me?" A flush crept up Hayes's neck, but he held her gaze steadily. "I am. Probably not doing a very good job of it, but yes. I love you, Victoria. Have almost since that first day when you were half drowned and still managed to thank me with perfect manners." Victoria laughed, tears of joy springing to her eyes. "I love you too, Hayes. And yes, I would very much like to build a life and a home with you." Hayes's face transformed with relief and happiness. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his feelings. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold band. "But it was my mother's. My father gave it to me before he died, said to save it for when I found the right woman." Victoria felt fresh tears well in her eyes as Hayes slipped the ring onto her finger. "It's perfect," she whispered, "and I'm honored to wear your mother's ring." Their engagement was announced the following Sunday at church, to general approval from the Columbus community. Mayor Hollister made a typically pompous speech about the joining of Eastern refinement with Western strength, while Mrs. Blackburn sniffed suspiciously into her handkerchief and muttered about having known all along that those two were meant for each other. The wedding was set for October, after the fall cattle drive and before the worst of winter weather would make travel difficult for Hayes's colleagues from Double Creek Ranch who wished to attend. Victoria wrote to her few remaining acquaintances in Boston, including her father's former business partner and his wife, who had been kind to her after her father's death. To her surprise and delight, they responded with warm congratulations and a promise to attend the wedding if the railroad schedule permitted. As summer gave way to fall, Victoria and Hayes settled into the pleasant rhythm of engaged life. They made plans for their future together. Hayes would continue as foreman at Double Creek, while Victoria taught at the schoolhouse. Mr. Montgomery, upon hearing of their engagement, had offered them the use of a small house on ranch property, significantly closer to town than the foreman's cabin Hayes currently occupied. "It was built for the previous foreman and his family," Mr. Montgomery explained when he showed them the snug two-bedroom structure. "Been sitting empty since he moved back east 3 years ago. Needs some work, but it's solid construction." Hayes surveyed the house with a critical eye, pointing out repairs needed to the roof and porch. Victoria walked through the small rooms, already envisioning curtains at the windows and books on shelves they would build together. "It's perfect," she declared, squeezing Hayes's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery." The older man nodded, pleased with her reaction. "Always thought Barrett here needed a good woman to settle him down properly. Just didn't expect he'd find one who nearly drowned herself to get his attention." Victoria laughed, while Hayes rolled his eyes at his employer's teasing. The story of their meeting had become something of a legend in Columbus, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until some versions had Hayes fighting off a mountain lion while rescuing Victoria from the clutches of a whirlpool. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Victoria divided her time between teaching, readying the house with Hayes, and working on her wedding dress with assistance from Mrs. Wallace and several other women who had become friends during her time in Columbus. Hayes, meanwhile, threw himself into renovations on the house, determined that it should be perfect when he brought his bride home. He replaced rotted boards on the porch, mended the roof, built simple but sturdy furniture, and even constructed bookshelves to house Victoria's growing collection of books, many ordered specially from Denver. October arrived with crisp mornings and golden afternoons, the aspen trees in the nearby mountains a blaze of yellow against the evergreen backdrop. On the day before the wedding, Victoria found herself strangely calm as she completed final preparations at the boarding house. Mrs. Blackburn fussed around her, more emotional than Victoria had ever seen the normally stoic widow. "Never thought I'd see the day when that Barrett fellow settled down," she remarked, adjusting the simple veil attached to the crown of fresh flowers that would adorn Victoria's hair the following day. "He was always so closed off, so distant. You've been good for him, girl." Victoria smiled, touched by the older woman's rare approval. "He's been good for me too, Mrs. Blackburn. I came west looking for purpose, for a place to belong. I found both and Hayes besides." Mrs. Blackburn sniffed suspiciously. "Well, just remember that marriage isn't all romance and moonlight. It's hard work and compromise and standing together when times get tough." "I know," Victoria assured her. "Hayes and I have both weathered our share of storms, literally and figuratively. We're entering this with open eyes." Later that evening, after a small dinner with her Boston friends who had indeed managed to make the journey west, Victoria stood on the boarding house porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow, she would become Victoria Barrett, wife of a ranch foreman in the Colorado Territory, a future so different from anything she had imagined while growing up in Boston that it sometimes seemed like a dream. A soft footstep on the porch steps drew her attention. Hayes stood there, hat in hand, looking up at her with an expression of such tenderness that Victoria's heart swelled in her chest. "It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," she teased gently. "I think we've had our share of bad luck already," Hayes replied, climbing the steps to join her. "Nearly drowning twice between us should cover it." Victoria laughed softly, stepping into his embrace. "What brings you here the night before our wedding? Surely not cold feet." Hayes tightened his arms around her. "Just the opposite. I couldn't sleep for thinking about tomorrow, about you. Needed to see you to make sure this was real and not something I'd dreamed up during those lonely years on the trail." Victoria reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, now clean-shaven in preparation for the wedding. "It's real, Hayes. We're real. And tomorrow we begin our life together officially, though I think our hearts have been joined since that day by the river." Hayes leaned down to kiss her, a gentle meeting of lips that held the promise of their shared future. "I should go," he murmured when they parted. "Early day tomorrow, and I have a feeling Mrs. Blackburn is watching from behind those curtains, ready to chase me off with a broom if I stay much longer." Victoria laughed, glancing toward the window where the curtain had indeed twitched suspiciously. "Go, then. I'll see you at the church tomorrow. I'll be the one in white." "And I'll be the nervous fellow at the altar," Hayes replied with a grin, backing down the steps. "Sleep well, Victoria Steele. Tomorrow you'll be Victoria Barrett." "I like the sound of that," Victoria called softly after him as he disappeared into the darkness. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the October air crisp but not cold. Victoria dressed with the help of Mrs. Wallace and her friend from Boston, Mrs. Eleanor Green. Her gown was simple but elegant cream-colored silk with delicate lace trim that had been shipped from Denver especially for the occasion. Her dark hair was arranged in a simple updo, crowned with a circlet of autumn flowers from which a short veil descended. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Green declared, stepping back to admire the final effect. "Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become, Victoria." Victoria blinked back tears at the mention of her father. "I wish he could be here," she said softly. "He would have liked Hayes, I think." They share a love of literature and a certain stubborn integrity. "He is here in spirit," Mrs. Wallace assured her, patting her hand, "just as Hayes's parents are with him today." The small church was filled to capacity when Victoria arrived on the arm of Mr. Green, who had graciously agreed to give her away in the absence of her own father. Sunlight streamed through the simple stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews where nearly every resident of Columbus sat, along with the entire staff of Double Creek Ranch, all in their Sunday best. And at the altar, waiting beside the minister, stood Hayes Barrett. He had traded his usual ranch clothes for a new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression a mixture of nervousness and absolute certainty as he watched Victoria walk down the aisle toward him. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and strong in the hushed church. When Hayes slipped a second gold band newly purchased to match her mother's engagement ring onto Victoria's finger, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Hayes did so with a gentle reverence that brought tears to many eyes in the congregation, including Victoria's own, as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Barrett. For the first time, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed at the town hall was joyous and boisterous. The women of Columbus had outdone themselves with food. The men had contributed liberally to a supply of wine and whiskey, and the local musicians played well into the evening as townsfolk and ranch hands alike danced and made merry. Through it all, Hayes kept Victoria close, as if unable to believe his good fortune. They received congratulations and well wishes from everyone, from Mayor Hollister, pompous but sincere, to the ranch hands, awkward but heartfelt, to Victoria's students, who had made a special book of drawings and stories as a wedding gift. As the evening wore on, Hayes leaned close to Victoria's ear. "Ready to see our home, Mrs. Barrett?" he murmured. Victoria nodded, her heart full to bursting with happiness. They made their goodbyes, enduring good-natured teasing from the guests, and slipped out to where Hayes's wagon waited, decorated with ribbons and flowers by the mischievous ranch hands. The ride to their new home under the star-filled sky was peaceful, Victoria nestled against Hayes's side on the wagon seat. When they arrived, Hayes surprised her by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Victoria," he said softly as he set her down in the main room. Victoria gasped in delight. The house had been transformed since her last visit. Fresh paint brightened the walls, curtains hung at the windows, and a fire crackled welcomingly in the hearth. But what caught her eye most was a small table in the center of the room, set with their wedding gifts, a fine china tea service from Mrs. Wallace, silver candlesticks from the Greens, a handmade quilt from Mrs. Blackburn, and dozens of other tokens of affection from the community. "Oh, Hayes," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It's perfect." Hayes wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Not quite perfect yet," he said, "but it will be now that you're here." Victoria turned in his embrace, reaching up to touch his face. "I love you, Hayes Barrett. Thank you for pulling me from that river and into your life." Hayes smiled, the open, unguarded smile that was still rare enough to be precious. "I love you too, Victoria Barrett, and I think perhaps it was you who pulled me to safety in all the ways that truly matter." As they sealed their new beginning with a kiss, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged, not in Boston, or even in Columbus specifically. but here in Hayes's arms, in the home they would build together, in the life they would share through whatever joys and challenges lay ahead. The river that had nearly claimed both their lives had, in its own way, given them to each other. And for that, Victoria would be forever grateful. Epilogue: 5 years later, the spring sun warmed Victoria's face as she sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching Hayes teaching their 3-year-old son, James, how to gentle a young foal. The boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard as the foal nuzzled his small hand, searching for treats. "Careful, Jamie," Hayes called. "Remember what I showed you, flat palm, fingers together." Victoria smiled as she observed her husband's patient instruction. In the 5 years since their wedding, Hayes had grown into fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything he undertook. Their son, named for both Hayes's father James and Victoria's father Edward, had his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Victoria's attention to the road, where she spotted a rider approaching at a leisurely pace. She recognized Thomas Peterson, one of her former students, now 17 and working as a clerk in the Columbus telegraph office. "Mrs. Barrett." Thomas called as he drew closer. "I have news from town and a telegram for Mr. Barrett." Victoria rose to greet him, one hand automatically moving to support her swollen belly. Their second child was due in less than 2 months, and Hayes had become increasingly protective, insisting that Victoria reduce her teaching schedule as her pregnancy progressed. "Good afternoon, Thomas," Victoria replied warmly. "Hayes is just in the paddock with Jamie. Would you care for some lemonade? I made it fresh this morning." "Yes, madam, that would be wonderful," Thomas agreed, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. Hayes, having noticed the visitor, lifted Jamie onto his shoulders and made his way toward the house. "Thomas," he greeted the young man with a nod. "What brings you out this way?" "Telegram came for you, Mr. Barrett," Thomas replied, handing over the yellow envelope. "And Mayor Hollister asked me to inform Mrs. Barrett that the school board has unanimously approved her proposal for the summer reading program." Victoria clapped her hands in delight. "That's wonderful news. I was concerned they might think it too ambitious." Hayes smiled at his wife's enthusiasm while opening the telegram. As he read the brief message, his expression grew serious, then thoughtful. "What is it?" Victoria asked, immediately noting the change. Hayes hesitated, then handed her the telegram. "From Pennsylvania," he said quietly. "My father's lawyer." Victoria read quickly, her eyes widening. "Hayes, this is significant news." Thomas, sensing a private moment, tactfully moved to admire the new foal in the paddock, taking Jamie with him after a nod from Hayes. "He left everything to me," Hayes said, still sounding stunned. "The house, his books, what savings remained. The lawyer says it's not a fortune, but it's substantial." Victoria took his hand. "You haven't spoken of your father often since you received word of his passing last year." Hayes nodded, his expression distant. "We reconciled through letters in those last few years, but there was still so much unspoken between us. I never expected this." "What do you want to do?" Victoria asked gently. Hayes was silent for a long moment, his eyes traveling over their home, the land they had gradually purchased from Mr. Montgomery piece by piece. The small herd of horses Hayes had begun breeding with his expertise. Finally, his gaze returned to Victoria, to her pregnant form and the love he saw reflected in her eyes. "This is our home," he said firmly. "But perhaps we should visit Pennsylvania after the baby comes, see the old house, decide what to keep, what to sell. Maybe bring back my father's books for our children to read someday." Victoria nodded, squeezing his hand. "I think that would be fitting. Your father's legacy living on through his grandchildren. Hayes pulled her close, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. I have everything I need right here, he murmured against her hair. But it would be good to close that chapter properly, to show our children where part of their history began. As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, watching their son laugh with delight as he fed the young foal an apple slice under Thomas's supervision, Victoria felt a profound sense of contentment. The journey that had begun with a near tragedy in the river had led to this life filled with love, purpose, and belonging. You ever think about that day in the river? She asked softly. When we first met, Hayes smiled against her temple. Only every time I look at you and marvel at my good fortune. Victoria turned in his embrace to meet his eyes. I was drowning in more ways than one when I came west lost, without purpose or connection. You didn't just save me from the river, Hayes. You helped me find my way to solid ground in every sense. We saved each other, Hayes replied, the simple truth of it evident in his clear blue eyes. And we'll keep doing so day by day, for all the years to come. As the afternoon sun gilded their small ranch in golden light, Victoria Barrett knew with absolute certainty that the current that had once threatened to claim her life had instead carried her precisely where she was meant to be, into the arms of a man who had taught her the true meaning of home, and into a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined that fateful day when she first arrived in Columbus.